women who tell our stories. So for those of you coming for the first time, I'm Liz McCluskey. I'm one of the organizers of the Women Who Stay series, along with Ann Kester, Ashley Click, and a most excellent advisory group of Holy Trinity parishioners. And we have been so blessed the past 2 weeks to have amazing women share with us the stories of other inspiring women of faith. And so this evening is no different as we welcome Dr. Copeland. And first, just to reiterate what Ann said about how we'll proceed, as we always do, we'll open with prayer, and then we'll have a full introduction of our speaker. And then there'll be an opportunity for discussion, and the method for that will be to put questions in the chat box, and you'll be invited to unmute if there's time to do that and ask your question. And we'll end at 6:30, even though we're getting started a little late. So we will be opening in prayer, and Anne, if you could put it on the screen, our prayers.
Loving God, lead us beyond ourselves to care and protect, to nourish and shape, to challenge and energize both the life and the world you have given us. God of light and God of darkness, God of conscience and God of courage, lead us through this time of spiritual confusion and public uncertainty. Give us the conscience it takes to comprehend what we're facing, to see what we're looking at, and to say what we see, so that others hearing us may also brave the pressure that comes. And my last line is obliterated.
With being out of public step.
Give us the courage to follow those before us who challenged wrong and changed it, whatever the cost to themselves.
Holy and beloved John Lewis lived a life of faith and courage and nonviolence. You never gave in, and you never gave up on the pursuit of racial justice and equality. You never stopped loving those who hurt you. You never stopped believing in the beloved community. Touch our conscience to put our love into action as you did. Venerable Henriette DeLille, founder of the Sisters of the Holy Family, you taught enslaved children when it was against the law. Touch our conscience on behalf of all those who are still not free, and give us your determination to ensure that all of us have an opportunity to flourish and use our gifts. God of conscience, God of courage, give us whatever grace we need to work for the coming of the reign of God, now, here, and always. Amen.
Amen.
Amen. Thank you so much. It is now my honor to introduce and welcome again Dr. Sean Copeland. So Dr. Copeland is Professor Emerita of Systematic Theology at Boston College, and she is a groundbreaking pioneer in Black Catholic theology and womanist theology. Her prophetic scholarship has earned her well-deserved recognition, including the Sojourner Truth Award, the Anne O'Hara Graff Memorial Award, as well as other things, and most recently, the John Courtney Murray Award, which is the highest honor given by the Catholic Theological Society of America, where Dr. Copeland was the first African-American theologian to hold the position of president. She has said ever since her grandmother traced the sign of the cross over her as a baby, and a 6th grade teacher planted the seed about studying theology, she's been on a path to share how theology can respond to suffering, especially suffering from persistent racism, sexism, and heterosexism. Memory, freedom, solidarity, these are all themes that run through Dr. Copeland's many areas of scholarly research, and they tie her works together, including the book Enfleshing Freedom, Body, Race, and Being, The Subversive Power of Love, The Vision of Henriette Delille. She was also the principal editor of Uncommon Faithfulness, The Black Catholic Experience, and editor with Jeremy Wilkins of Grace and Friendship, Theological Essays in Honor of Fred Lawrence. She has authored more than 125 articles, reviews, and book chapters. And this evening, she's going to talk about some insights from one of her books, and that is The Subversive Power of Love, The Vision of Henriette Delille. And this is about how Henrietta DeLille used the power of love to bring good out of the injury of evil. She had love that met evil with good to break the cycle of violence and oppression, which sounds familiar. She was a person who was willing to risk getting in trouble, good trouble, necessary trouble to do what was right. So this book was first a lecture at the Madeleva Lecture series at St. Mary's College. And I looked at all the people who have given this lecture, and it is really a who's who of women in theology. And it's an amazing, amazing company that you keep Dr. Copeland, and many of these respected scholars we have tapped for our Women Who Stay series, their scholarship, including yours. So we're incredibly, incredibly fortunate that you are here, Dr. Copeland, that you can hear us, and that though you're not physically present, we feel your presence. And we all look forward to learning more about Henriette Delille, especially whether I'm pronouncing her name correctly, and what she might say to us today about how our faith can inspire the ongoing struggle for freedom. So with that, Dr. Copeland, I turn the audio over to you to tell us a little something.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes, yes,
Okay.
loud and clear.
All right, good. I just want to get my time up so I won't talk too long and save sufficient time for a conversation. First of all, thank you all for inviting me. You've had a wonderful rota of significant women offering us guidance and courage during these days. Not simply the days that we've been experiencing in quarantine, and then the days we've been experiencing, particularly since the deaths of Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and George Floyd, but certainly those days, I wanted to try to talk a little bit tonight about Henriette Delille, and it's a French name. So all of us who are anglicizing are always struggling to do it. I struggle. Henriette Delille, and there is a city in France called Delisle. But I want to talk a little bit about holiness and the cultural production of evil. So it's an interesting way to think about subversive love. That is love that subverts this cultural production. This is precisely what she does. And what I'd like to begin with a little bit about the history, because that's the history which produces the evil, the culture that produces the evil, and the religion that is more or less silent in the midst of it. And then talk a little bit about Henriette Delille, who is up for canonization at this time, a very unusual woman, and see what we can learn about her movements in a very restricted society. We already, as you've noted in prayer, have an excellent exemplar in the life and work of Representative John R. Lewis. So we're grateful that he is an example for us and taking up his own leadership on the other side to be an inspiration to us and a defender of those causes which truly further the beloved community. So first, as I said, I would like to speak a little bit about the religious, cultural, and social context in which she was born, and then say something really about her. There's a lot I would like to say, but I really need to make sure I cut my time so I don't lose it by talking too much, and then you don't get to talk back at me. So first of all, to talk about the cultural, social, and religious context. When we think of New Orleans, we think France, we think French, you think French Quarter, and surely you think Mardi Gras, for certain. Even in this horrific time, I'm sure people thought Mardi Gras, tried to figure out a way to celebrate. French explorers founded New Orleans in 1718, so the city as a colony of France is much older than the United States. It was named after Philip II, Duke of Orleans and Regent of France. But before the French arrived, there were the indigenous people, the Choctaw and the Natchez, who lived in that area. New Orleans was the capital of French Louisiana from 1722 until 1763, when the colony was handed over to the Spanish. And they controlled it for nearly 40 years. But when the United States took over that territory in 1803, New Orleans was still very much a colonial French city. It was the leading city of the Lower South in the 19th century. It rivaled New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Charleston in commercial activity, in efficiency and prosperity. But that success rested in large measure on Black bodies, that traffic in Black bodies, the slave trade. The first ship carrying captured Africans for sale arrived in Louisiana in 1719, and over the next dozen years, roughly 6,000 men, women, and children entered the colony through the slave trade. By the time Henriette DeLille was born in 1812, New Orleans was the site of North America's largest slave trade. Slavery was rife, of course, in the United States, and the Revolutionary War brought British rule to an end and the adoption of the Constitution. This brought about a secure federal government. But the historian John Hope Franklin observes that founding fathers of the American Republic, quote, were dedicated to the proposition that government should rest upon the dominion of property. This is very interesting. So voting rights in the United States is always an unfinished project. The first voters were white men with property. By protecting property, the Constitution recognized the institution of human slavery, because for the Southerners, property meant slaves. For Northerners, it meant land, commerce, and industry. Prior to and well before its ratification, free Blacks, the few that there were, Quakers and abolitionists hoped the Constitution would eradicate slavery, but it did not. In 1793 and again in 1850, the United States Congress passed the Fugitive Slave Law, thereby rendering all Black women, men, and children, whether freeborn or emancipated, subject to kidnap and enslavement. It also incriminated all white women and men and children in slave catching, slave trading, and slave holding. So if you've seen the film, which was out a few years ago, Solomon Northrop's 12 Years a Slave, there's also Harriet, which is more recently released. Solomon Northrop in particular, this movie is based on his own narrative. So he's narrating for us things that he experienced. Born a free man in New York, kidnapped, taken to Washington, D.C., enslaved, held in a pen in sight of the Capitol until he's moved south. Slavery was also not alien to the Roman Catholic Church. We know that popes, beginning in 1435, issued a series of condemnations of the slave trade. But 400 years later, in 1839, Gregory XVI repeated this reproach against slavery. While these reproaches, these bulls, these statements attacked slavery in the ideal, the slave trade went on. So papal teaching, while it forbade Catholic clerics or laypersons to defend, publish, or teach in public or in private, anything that supported the slave trade, the trade went on, and so did Catholic support. Southern Catholics sought to be just like all Southerners, and so they sought political and civic acceptance without surrender of religious identity and integrity. But well before the high tide of Catholic immigration in the 19th century, the church had made a compromise with slavery that left some with uneasy consciences. Slavery was the shibboleth of Southern civilization, writes Randall Miller, the historian. Acceptance in the Old South, he continued, meant getting right with slavery, close quote. Getting right with slavery included the purchase, ownership, and sale of enslaved persons. In the Upper South, Catholic slaveholders lived alongside their Protestant planter counterparts. Some Catholic families thrived in the South, owning slaves, achieving great wealth, professional success, and social and political status. We know that religious orders owned slaves, orders of women and men, whether they were the Jesuits, the Carmelites, the Sulpicians in Maryland, the Ursulines, Religious of the Sacred Heart, and Capuchins in Louisiana, the Visitation Nuns in Washington, D.C., the Dominicans, the Sisters of Charity and Sisters of Loretto in Kentucky, and the Vincentians in Missouri. This is all well documented. You can find an excellent treatment of some of these matters in Cyprian Davis's The History of Black Catholics in the United States. Getting right with slavery meant defending the rightness of enslavement. So here you're against papal teaching. With conspicuous exception, the hierarchy failed to challenge the culture and system that legitimated, sustained, and benefited from slavery. The Vatican urged American bishops both prior to and after emancipation to evangelize the enslaved and newly emancipated people. But for the most part, their exhortations fell on deaf ears. Now, to be sure, the hierarchy in the US was confronted with a complex pastoral situation. The needs of growing culturally and linguistically diverse immigrant populations. It was also the problem, or question, if you like, which is better really, of lay trusteeism. There was a shortage of clergy and religious. There were long geographic distances to cover, and there were often breakdowns in communication. The church also suffered from nativism, and there was a lot of anti-Catholic sentiment among abolitionists. But once again, we've traded care of Black souls for maintaining our privilege and our position in the larger society. From my position, or my thinking, the Catholic Church in the US, especially prior to emancipation, faltered in its responsibility to offer a prophetic gospel witness to slaveholding society, and ignored its own teaching regarding the dignity of all human persons and even the rights of slaves. The hierarchy relegated the question of slavery to the social sphere. It had nothing to do with it. It was a social or political matter, nothing religious about it. But Miller, this is Randall Miller again, asserts, quote, the church yielded up its social conscience to the status quo and devoted itself to the city of God, close quote. Further, he charged, even in New Orleans, where the church possessed the numbers, wealth, and prestige to withstand social and political criticism, the Catholic establishment offered no critique of Southern culture, close quote. Now, this is the context in which Henriette DeLille was born. Henriette DeLille was born in 1812 and died in November 1862, a few months after the occupation of New Orleans by Union soldiers and a few weeks before President Abraham Lincoln promulgated the Emancipation Proclamation. She would have been about 21 years old when Mariah Stewart spoke to an interracial and mixed gender audience at African Masonic Hall here in Boston. She would have been about 26 when Frederick Douglass escaped Maryland slavery, and she would have been about 27 when Gregory XVI condemned the slave trade in the famous apostolic letter In Supremo Apostolatus Fastigio. She came to maturity then during a very fractious period when there were many national debates about whether or not freed slaves should remain in the United States or should they be deported back to Africa. So this is a very, it's a very interesting and contentious debate. Maybe some questions about it later. Her family is entwined intimately with Louisiana's origins. DeLille's matrilineal line begins with a great-great-grandmother, an enslaved African woman named Nanette. Nanette was baptized Marianne. She bore at least 3, possibly 4 children for Claude Delisle, who was a wealthy planter, miller, and engineer who played a major role in establishing Louisiana as a French colony. At his death in 1757, Delisle owned more than 500 slaves, but he made no provision to emancipate Nanette or her children. However, by 1763, when she was perhaps about 50, Nanette gained her freedom from Delisle's son and namesake. She was determined and resourceful, and somehow managed, at the cost of more than $2,000, she purchased her daughter Cecile, as well as her grandchildren, Henriette and Narcisse. 2 decades after they had escaped bondage, Henriette Delille's great-grandmother and great-aunt could be counted among well-to-do property holders in New Orleans. Delille's mother, Marie-Joseph Diaz, like her mother, grandmother, and great-grandmother, entered into what was called in the low country South, South Carolina and Louisiana, parts of Alabama, what was called the system of Plaçage, P-L-A-C-A-G-E. Plaçage, I'll talk a little bit about that. She gave birth, Marie-Joseph Diaz, to 4 children, the youngest of whom was Henriette. Neither baptismal or legal documents record the name of Henriette's father. However, Cyprian Davis conjectures that she and her brother, Jean Delisle, may have had the same father, while their sister, Cecile, may have been fathered by another man. Little is known of Henriette Delille's early childhood or early education. When she was about 16, her mother was declared mentally unstable, and probably, according to Davis, she returned to her sister Cecile for emotional and financial support. She may have been a pupil at the St. Claude Street School run by Sister Sainte Marthe Frontière, a sister of the Dame Hospitalière coming from near Lyon in France. Sister Sainte Marthe came to Louisiana at the request of the apostolic administrator of the diocese, Louis William de Bourgh. Her mission was to open a school for young girls of color. Presumably, instruction was conducted in the French language. The curriculum included reading, writing, arithmetic, geography, and most especially religion. These were students who were being educated to educate. At some point, Henriette Delille may have been an instructor at that school, but she was expected to follow the traditions of her mother and grandmothers, to enter into this system of plaçage, to form an alliance with a powerful white man of financial means. This man would have kept her and her children, set her up in a house. She was not an enslaved person, but she was not really free to marry someone who was white. And this man frequently had a white family. So you already have a rather complex repudiation, tentative, anomalous acceptance of a social situation for survival. To me, this is a very problematic strategy, but it is a strategy that some women used during this time. About the year 1836, Delille drew up in French a document entitled The Rules and Regulations for the Congregation of the Sisters of the Presentation of the Blessed Virgin Mary. And their aim was to imitate the life of the first Christians, of whom the Blessed Virgin after the Ascension was the mother and model. Their aim was to care for the sick, assist the poor, and instruct those in need of education. These were not sisters in the technical sense that we know vowed women religious who are active. They were lay women who did not yet live together. They took neither solemn nor simple religious vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, and they were often married with a family. The directives called for the members to assemble at least once a month. This is kind of like a confraternity or a sodality, if you think back Some of us may remember from our Catholic girlhood being a member of the sodality. Maybe there's someone out there who does. I certainly remember the sodality, but in any case, they met once a month in a church to recite psalms or receive instruction in Christian life and to listen to spiritual reading. They were to care for those among their number who fell ill, ensure in treatment by a physician or a nurse, and provide spiritual solace of the sacraments. They were obliged to assist at the funeral of a deceased member and to pray for her. And should she leave children, the congregation was to assume their care, dependent upon sufficient funds. Further, in order to support their corporal works of mercy, each sister was to make an annual offering of at least $1 as a monthly contribution of 50 cents. In their really apostolic aim and communal commitment and spiritual orientation, this society of pious women of color was not unlike that founded by the Anglican widow, Elizabeth Bailey Seton, prior to her joining the Roman Catholic Church. So this is really following along a line that's already there. We doubt that Henriette DeLille knew about Elizabeth Bailey Seton, but this impulse, if you like, seems to be alive, and you could say that it's a movement of the spirit. The society inspired and founded by DeLille was the first female religious society of this sort among the Black people of Louisiana. There is a slow movement, of course, from being a pious society of devout women to a proto-religious community to vowed religious life. This was a very gradual movement. So over the course of 5 to 10 years, the new bishop, Antoine Blanc, sought approbation from Rome for the group of pious women organized by DeLille and requested a formal document attesting that the group was affiliated with the congregation. It's in this light that Henriette DeLille and Juliette, a friend of hers, and later Josephine Charles, began a more concentrated and focused ministry with the aid of Father Etienne Roussillon. The year would have been about 1842. So this is about 6 years from her first movement to try to do something like this. So we have Henriette DeLille, Juliette Gaudin, and Josephine Charles. All these 3 women were women of color from New Orleans. They served as godparents and witnesses for the baptisms and marriages of enslaved people and other people of color. Initially, Roussillon helped them to find a house on St. Bernard Street, but when the municipal officials brought a wounded man to them for care, for the sake of propriety, they moved into a small house on the Bayou Road. This house is what Cyprian Davis calls the cradle of the fledgling group. It was constructed for them and partially financed by the modest inheritance that DeLille received from her mother upon her mother's death. We don't have any idea precisely what they did every day, a kind of schedule. We don't have a good picture early on in the 1840s, but 1842 is their signature year. They trace themselves, their founding, to this year. But they took these corporal works of mercy very seriously. They catechized enslaved people and free people of color, taught basic literacy, sheltered orphans, nursed the sick and the elderly and the destitute, and they shared food and clothing with those who were needy. By 1851, they seemed to demonstrate, these 3 women, a real understanding of religious life. And so the archdiocese then permitted them to make religious vows. They changed their dress. They moved from a blue dress to a black dress. They began wearing rosaries around their neck. This is the picture that Liz McCluskey has put up for you. You have a beautiful picture of Henriette DeLille with a rosary around her neck on the little email that you sent me. Wearing the rosary around their neck, they took private vows and committed themselves to the church and to those they called our people. These were the freed and continued to be enslaved people. They were also people of color and poor, destitute people in New Orleans. She died of tuberculosis on November 17th in the year 1862 at the age of 50. For more than 25 years, she had devoted herself without stint to the cause of the poor, to enslaved people, instructing children. And their ministry really provided a kind of challenge, if you will, to the racially limited parameters of antebellum white benevolence and exposed the timidity of the church in terms of its care for enslaved and free people of color. Now, I've talked for about 20 minutes, so do you want me to stop for a little bit here now? There's a lot more to talk about, but I'm sure people might have questions that can pull out some of the things I would have said if that's good for you in terms of your timetable.
Yeah. So happy to open it up for questions, everyone. Again, you can either put it in the chat box and I can ask it for you, or if you'd like to ask yourself, you could just raise your hand with the hand function, as it's called, the hand tool, whichever you would like to do.
Yeah, I was going to ask. I was going to ask a question. What was it? Yeah. Oh gosh, I can't think of what it was. I was going to ask now.
We can come back to you, Barbara. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. Why don't we do that? Okay.
Well, that's a famous name, Lange. Barbara Lange. Lange is a famous name.
That's right.
Did not
Lange. It's not pronounced Lange.
Oh.
It's Lange. Lang.
No, it isn't. That's my point. But her name is that way. It's
Yeah.
just missing. Yeah. Thank you.
So a few questions. One, do you know where she's buried? Somebody asked if she's buried in New Orleans.
Yes, the Sisters of the Holy Family don't have a cemetery on their property, but she would be buried probably in St. Louis Cemetery. I think it's either one or two, which is in New Orleans.
Okay.
Yes.
And then Deb Bartolozzi, you have a similar question than I have. Do you want to go ahead and ask your question? Deb, can you unmute?
Yeah, so I'm wondering what were the dangers and consequences of educating people of color in any way?
Well, this is a great question because it's why I began with the issue of a little bit of context. If you have a law in 1850 that runs through the United States about fugitive slaves, and you have the Fugitive Slave Law, which was first passed in 1797, and then again in 1850. There were some earlier, but these are the definitive ones. The Fugitive Slave Law, of course, means that everyone is subject to kidnap. So it doesn't matter who you are if you happen to have dark skin. So teaching people to read is a subversive act in and of itself, since this is forbidden by law. In the South, this would have been punishable by severe beatings. If you read slave narratives, you will find many stories of people who have lost a finger, more than one finger, a hand, for trying and attempting to learn to read and write. So this is really it's a very daring act. And there's a religion such as Christianity, and in particular Catholic Christianity, requires literacy. You have a catechism. And if you can't read the catechism, then you can't really hold on to the teachings. I'm not suggesting that anybody read or study the current catechism of the Roman Catholic Church. Is not possible. But some people might remember the old Baltimore Catechism, which took you through grade school from about the first or second grade right through to the 8th grade. And then when you got to high school, there was something different going on. Sometimes in the 6th grade, something else happened. But that catechism were put out for you the basic tenets of the faith, the 10 Commandments, the sacraments, days of holy days of obligation. It set out various prayers and so on. So in this way, put the word learned in quotes. There was probably nothing really very learned about most of the people involved in ministry at that time, but they had a real grasp of what was essential for people in terms of communicating the faith. There's a wonderful quote here, if I can just continue with this a little bit. It's asking really, what does it mean? This is my reflection. I want to say, what does it mean to be holy in confrontation with and in defiance of the cultural production of evil as mediated through the oppressive and vicious regime of racial slavery, segregation, protracted discrimination? Well, certainly the dynamic of racial domination spawned a social and cultural situation that required a response of extraordinary measure. So, I mean, a good example of this, of course, is John Lewis himself. There's an evocative scenario we could put forward, thinking of the great Spanish Carmelite mystic John of the Cross. If you are locked in a windowless room with no access to the outside, are you a prisoner? Or is it a portal, a doorway? Is it a portal always open, an inner door shaped exactly like your hope? Then you can enter and then journey toward the creator of all things. So there is people taking this horrific situation and doing something profoundly spiritual with it that also has social and cultural consequences. Is that useful?
Yes. Yes. Thank you, Shawn.
You're welcome. Yeah.
So we have other questions coming in here. So Liz is asking, can you talk more about the obstacles Henriette would have faced by not entering into the system of passage?
Well, first of all, you'd have to ask yourself, how will you make a living? What will you do? Can you be employed by way of a school? Can you start a school? You have to have some means. You have to have some funds. The idea of getting a bank loan is not unheard of in the 1800s. So that's possible, but you have to have some collateral. So your reputation would have stood to be important in that context, but you would have been giving up a lot as well. So obstacles in this case include the need to have some funds, and she had some funds, very savvy. The other thing would be to think about the status of Black women at that time. It's very, very, very low, very denigrated in this way. If you had a hierarchy at that period, the very bottom of that hierarchy would be Black women. And the persistence of that feeling about Black women in a certain way is tinged with our lack of outrage over Breonna Taylor. So we had to be moved to deal with the death of Breonna Taylor. Now it's true, we didn't see that death, it wasn't public. We weren't outraged in the same way of visually seeing someone murder someone on a videotape with people, Black and white, standing around pushing, begging this person to stop. But the fact of the matter is that's precisely what happened. Someone was murdered in her own bed. We also, of course, have to determine the innocence of our Black victim. So, because if you might have had drugs, if you might have been a courier, well, there you go. You get what you deserve. So if you think about the status of Black women, what were Black women used for during this period from about 1619, if you want to go forward, if you want to just go the whole way, not just Jamestown, Virginia is South, but it's not New Orleans. It's a very different kind of situation. And slaves are very valuable in this context, but you can still mistreat them. So you use Black women for labor. You also use them for reproduction. So you want more slaves, then you have enslaved women bear more children. So she's a capital investment. She brings back something to the plantation. This is very bitter. This is very bitter when we think about how we have used and manipulated human beings. So these women are, in a real way, in the system of plissage, these are ballrooms. You go down to the ballroom and you're sitting around a gallery and people look up and they can see you and they decide who they want to establish a liaison with. And it's in this way that someone is, in fact, you could say, rescued from gross prostitution and given some stability. She's going to have clothing, food, a place to live, her children. The boys are sent to France often, if the man is particularly wealthy, for education. But the girls are expected, particularly if they're beautiful, to go back into the system. Walter Johnson does very well with this in his book, Soul by Soul, which is an excellent history of the slave trade in the South. And he pays attention to New Orleans and to South Carolina and this practice. So, so when you think about her courage not to establish this kind of family with a man, their children, but to start a group called the Sisters of the Holy Family, it's a really subversive use of the notion of family. We're creating something here. There's also this idea that Black women are not chaste. This is certainly, this religious order is founded, of course, because there's no place for her in any other religious community. Not the Ursulines, not the Religious of the Sacred Heart. There, in 1829, the Oblate Sisters of Providence, very close to many of you in Baltimore, are founded because there's no place for these women in any other religious community. So it's not until very late in the middle of the 20th century, around 1955, 54, we start to have young Black women going into predominantly white religious congregations. So is that the selectivity of the Holy Spirit? Some of us don't think that that's the case. Is this clarifying a little bit of what's at stake here?
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So Rich Landfill is wondering whether were any members of the order, her house, ever prosecuted? Did authorities go after them in any way for teaching, for catechizing?
Well, here's not to my knowledge, not to my research. Margaret Gould has done a lot of research on this, and so has, of course, Gwendolyn Midlow Hall and Cyprian Davis, but not to any of, those are all historians, and they don't seem to turn anything over like that. But here's also something that's happening, is that people are doing this not publicly in the eye, but privately and quietly. The other thing is that New Orleans is also much more flexible than the United States. I mean, I'm separating it out. Why? Because in 1803, when the Louisiana Purchase went into effect, the response was, here come the English-speaking people. It's a very different reception. French and Spanish cultures dealt with enslaved people very differently than did English culture. Anglo-Saxon culture, if you will. So there is a certain way in which, if this is religious education and you have to have a catechism, remember, then we have a kind of wink and nod. We see, but we don't see.
Mm-hmm.
Is that useful?
Yeah, that's very interesting.
Well, if you look at the way in which, well, Spanish slavery, think of, and Portuguese slavery in Brazil. Brazil has a lively and vibrant religious community among enslaved, the descendants of enslaved Africans, because people were able to cover, if you will, some people would call this syncretism and won't like it. But if you think of syncretism as creativity, they covered over their orisha from Yoruba religion, which is what is happening in Brazil. It's not called Yoruba religion, it's called candomblé. It's Yoruba. If you go to Nigeria and you see Yoruba religion, that's what you'll see when you're in Brazil. And it's frozen in time because all oppressed people are conservative. You hang on to what you have. You hang on tightly to what you have. You try to preserve it. And they were creative in covering over their saints. So Shango became Saint Barbara with her red robe and her sword. Well, for them, that was the god of war. Imanja, with her beautiful blue, became the Virgin Mary. So there's a way in which the alertness and the religious virtuosity of African peoples comes through in religion. The United States, we were much more repressive in Anglo-Saxon culture here. So there are a lot of balls in the air. I mentioned nativism. I mentioned the anti-Catholic sentiment of abolitionists. And so you have the Catholic Church trying to conform to this way of behaving and acting. We get, in fact, segregated churches in Louisiana, or we get spaces for Black people to be in the church. So the black people are in the back of the church. They go to communion last. And this lasted a very long time into the 50s in the United States, in northern cities. So there's a real, what should I say? I mean, there's a wink and a nod out of Spanish and French culture, but not so out of sort of Anglo-Saxon culture that really that permeates really our thinking, first of all, about those cultures and about people in New Orleans. If you recall Hurricane Katrina, many people were clear to say, gosh, they're getting punished because of Mardi Gras, all their drinking and sinning here. I mean, there's a way in which Anglo-Saxon culture is much more aesthetic in a punitive way. There's little release in that culture as there is in French, as there is in Spanish culture. This is a conjecture of a part-time cultural anthropologist, me. I'm sure there are many people who might object to that, but I'm reading it as I understand it from my own studies. So.
Thank you.
I'm looking at your 6:25. I don't want to hold your group here any longer.
I'm watching the time, so I think I'm going to go. There are really some great questions. So, Suzanne Noonan, would you like to ask your question, and maybe we can wrap with that? And I'm going to plug also that Shawn, you had a great Commonweal article. It was in June. Breath and Fire.
Yes. July.
So you all might want to look that up, called Breath and Fire in Commonweal magazine. So Suzanne, please feel free to unmute, or I can do it for you.
Shawn, taking a great leap forward here. In our own time, and particularly recently since these three iconic deaths, how would you characterize the Catholic hierarchy's response towards A, those events, and B, systemic racial injustice in this day and age compared to what it was in slavery, the time of slavery in New Orleans?
It's never been good, and it's not good now. It's very disappointing. It's very disappointing. We're concerned now to open up our churches, I'm sure everywhere, and we're doing it gradually and carefully. So because of that, we are not really attending, most of us, not all, most of us are not really attending closely and carefully to the racial situation. It's very sad for me personally as a theologian to witness this. There have been some very fine statements by a few bishops. But the hierarchy from my perspective as a whole has not been forceful or clear or direct about this. And so in our opening of churches, we're concerned about pastoral issues, and we miss the point that white racist supremacy and that racism is a pastoral issue for Black and brown Catholics. Racism is a pastoral issue. It's not some little social issue off in the side. This is where we got started with this. It's a social issue. We can't get involved in it. But it affects people who belong to your church. We're very concerned about all our medical issues, no matter what they are. Prolonged life, termination of life, but we're afraid, or we are reluctant, or we don't want to, or we're indifferent to the social issue. And the last point I would make, it is a pastoral issue for Black Catholics, but it's a pastoral issue for everyone, because it's killing white people too. It's not just killing Black people or brown people, it's killing white people too.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank
You're
you.
welcome. Thanks for asking.
If I can hold you for one more question, because a couple of people have tied this to our own history at Holy Trinity, which you may know sits a block away from Georgetown University campus. We have a shared history in that Archbishop John Carroll was our founder, both at the parish and the university. I'm sure you know of the university's repentance for the ownership of slaves by the Jesuits in its history. And of course, that's part, Holy Trinity shares in that history. We had parishioners who owned slaves. The first couple to be married in Holy Trinity's chapel was a slave woman and a freed man. Holy Trinity, both the chapel and the church were built by slaves. There was a time in our history when the slave parishioners eventually left the parish, started Epiphany Parish over towards East Georgetown. So, I think at Holy Trinity, we struggle both with how can we begin to address this history more forthright, but also how could we kind of I don't know, reintegrate, bring, because our parish remains predominantly white, not the kind of diversity that many of us would like to see. And it's a question of how do we reach out and invite people to be back and kind of restore the diversity that it was in a different age and time.
Well, this is really something that James Cone might say. And I was reminded of it by a student, a white student, not too long ago. It's James Cone by way of Kelly Brown Douglas, one of his students, who lived in your area teaching at Goucher College, and is an Episcopal priest, a Black Episcopal priest. And what Reverend Dr. Douglas said was, white people don't have to be white. And it's a powerful comment. In other words, you don't have to own that old history of negativity and of racial animus and of slaveholding. You have to be different in the present, because you're not responsible for what happened 100 years ago or 150 years ago. You didn't do that. You know, probably nobody on this call owned slaves, or your family owned slaves. And when you talk with students, that's the first thing they all say. Well, I didn't own any slaves. Well, of course you did. But what's true is that we have to behave differently in the present, and that's what you're asking. And part of that is not simply going out and recruiting some Black people to come back, because the experience of Black Catholics is that every time we get back together with the majority culture, pretty soon we're not there anymore. Pretty soon all the things that you like and want to do are there, and we're gone. So this is history. This is Thomas Wyatt Turner and John Lafarge and Marco, those two Jesuit priests, Lafarge and Marco, and Thomas Wyatt Turner. Federated colored Catholics, all gone because they wanted to integrate and have the interracial Catholic Council. What you can do, though, is educate yourselves. It seems to me that's what you're trying to do, so that the next time people come by, they will find you ready and willing and informed allies who know yourself, who know when you're behaving badly and correct yourself. And that's another way of thinking about an examen of conscience. When am I behaving badly racially? And can I correct myself? And if you do that, you get yourself ready for people who will drop by. You can have, if I don't know Epiphany Parish, I don't think I've been there. I've been in Washington years ago. I haven't been there in a long time. But if that parish is working, you can find things you can do together, but together. You can't expect, especially now, because there's a core of young white people who are the beneficiaries of about 50 years of ethnic studies, feminist studies, Latinx studies, Chicano studies, Mexican American studies, African studies, African American studies, Black studies. They're getting this in college. They're reading Cornell West. They're reading Kelly Brown Douglas. They're reading these people. So they're learning something. And so you have to be ready to also talk with them. And you've got to do that. You've got to do your homework. You just got to do your homework so that when people start showing up, you know how to be a good ally. It's not all in a textbook. It's also trial and error. Sometimes we'll be successful, sometimes we won't. But you have to just try. Maybe you can have a reading group, but don't ask the Black people to explain to you how you shouldn't be racist. That you can figure out on your own. You're all Christians. When you're, it's sort of the old Santa Claus, when you've been good, when you've not, you know it. We all know it. We all know it.
Yeah. No,
Yeah.
Thank you for that. That's really helpful. People are asking a number of questions and making comments about what we can be doing as a parish. And a number of people are asking that you join us again sometime for another parish event. We've enjoyed this conversation, and it's just such excellent insights that you've given us. So if you're
you are educators,
like to have
yeah.
Yeah, it would be really terrific. So if there aren't any other last thoughts, we're going to actually wrap up with a prayer for the beatification of Henriette DeLille. Her community is still thriving in New Orleans, right?
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. Yes, it is. Yes, it is.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Oh, you're welcome. This has just been absolutely terrific.
Thank you ever so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Close with that prayer.
Yes, thank you. This was terrific.
So it reads, "O good and gracious God, you called Henriette DeLille to give herself in service and in love to the slaves and the sick, to the orphan and the aged, to the forgotten and the despised. Grant that inspired by her life, we might be renewed in heart and mind. And if it be your will, may she one day be raised to the honor of sainthood. By her prayers, may we live in harmony and peace. Through Jesus Christ, our Lord. Amen."
Okay. All right. Well, have a nice evening, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank
Have a
you
nice
so much.
evening, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Is anybody still on? I am